Hello, welcome to Microhistory. I'm Jeremy Reimer. So far on this series, we've talked about what we could consider the first personal computer, which we all kind of agree is the Altair 8800. And we've talked about Ed Roberts, who built it. We've talked about Bill Millard and the IMSI 8080, which was the first personal computer to clone. And we've talked about Daniel Meyer and the SWTP 6800, which we could consider the first, I would say, alternate computer with a little bit of a different philosophy. So that takes us through to the end of 1975. All these three computers and founders and inventors, none of them are commonly known today. None of the companies survived. There's a tiny company that in 1976 released a new computer that wasn't all that different from the Altair or the IMSI or the 6800. But this company not only survived, but it became the most profitable tech company in history, and today is the third most valuable company in the world, worth $3 trillion. That's trillion with a T. How did they achieve this? And what was their story? Steve Wozniak was born August 11, 1950 in San Jose, California. His father was an engineer for Lockheed Corporation, working on top-secret missiles. It was the Cold War, and beating Russia was the most important thing in the world. And so this was the perfect situation for young Steve to grow up in a world where electronics and transistors and new technology was being developed. Steve was a pretty precocious kid. He built his first crystal radio from a kit at age 6. When he was 11, with his father's help, he studied for and received a ham radio operator's license. So he could talk to people all over the area on his ham radio. And he also soldered together the ham radio by himself. So at 11, he was already building his first communications kits, electronics kits. And of course, he started reading his father's electronic journals, which were just lying about the house. Steve loved the Tom Swift books, which were pretty popular at the time. They were kind of a Hardy Boys for geeks. Tom Swift was an engineer who frequently was asked to save the entire world with his amazing inventions. Steve loved all this stuff. He loved the environment he was growing up in. He loved electronics. He loved the concept of Boolean algebra. And he loved building things like his ham radio. So for his 8th grade science fair, he built an adder subtractor out of transistors, lights, and switches. And this could add or subtract numbers and display the results on a bunch of lights up to, it was 10 bits, so 1024. And he won first prize, not surprisingly, at the science fair. And as an additional award, he got to have a tour of the Strategic Air Command at Travis Air Force Base and a flight on a jet, which he had never done before, in 8th grade. So you get a sense of this kid, really smart kid, very into electronics, very into learning how things work. He also built a communications with speakers and some wires that he literally got off the back of a truck. Hooked up all his friends' houses that were next door, his neighbors, and they could talk to each other, had a little buzzer, and they could communicate. And he was doing all this in high school. Now, in high school, he got a hold of a book called the Digital Equipment Corporation Small Computer Handbook.
And I took this book home that described the PDP-8 computer, and it was just like a Bible to me. I mean, all these things that for some reason I'd fallen in love with, like you might fall in love with a card game called Magic, or you might fall in love with doing crossword puzzles or something else, or playing a musical instrument. I fell in love with these little descriptions of computers on their inside, and it was a little mathematics. I could work out some problems on paper and solve it and see how it's done, and I could come up with my own solutions and feel good inside.
So of course, what does Steve do? He starts designing his own mini computers. This is all on paper. He's a high school kid. He can't afford any electronic components. And remember, mini computers, they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars at this time in the late 60s. So he graduated from Homestead High in Cupertino in 1968. He went to the University of Colorado, and he got into a bit of trouble for running programs that would print their output on paper. Of course, a lot of things were printed on paper because the display terminals were still so expensive. But he built these programs that would run and print bigger and bigger and bigger in numbers, and he used up an entire semester's worth of paper. Got into a bit of trouble, was going to be put on probation. He kind of decided to, we'll switch colleges, closer to home in 1969. He decides, I'm going to take a year off. He's finished his second year of university, and it's fine, but he wants to take a bit of a break. And he wants to buy his own computer. This is his dream. He wants to own his own computer, but what are the options? Well, there's a Data General Nova. Of course, we know this from before, instrumental in inspiring the case design for the Altair. This is before the Altair exists. So he goes down to what he thinks is a store, and it turns out it's actually a company called Tenet, a computer company that makes their own computers, and he gets hired immediately as a programmer. A year later, the company goes bankrupt. But here's the important thing. Because he knows the executives at this company and he was a good employee, they give him some free parts. Going out of business sale, they hear some free chips. So the next year, 1971, he transfers to the University of California at Berkeley, very famous university for computer science. But in 1971, what was going on there? Not a lot. Nothing really interesting. Historically, Berkeley had a program sponsored by ARPA, which went on to invent the ARPANET, which became the internet. But actually, Berkeley didn't join the ARPANET until much later. UCLA was the big California node, and that was Vint Cerf, who went on to invent the internet. A whole other story. But in the meantime, Steve is still obsessed with owning his own computer. This is all he wants in life, is to own his own computer. He told his dad about his dream to build a computer, and of course his dad thought he was crazy. Computers in 1971 cost the same as a house. But, he had some chips lying around, and he and his friend, Bill Fernandez, decided to build one anyway. For fun. So in 1971, you couldn't just buy a microprocessor. It hadn't been invented yet. But you could build one with TTL chips. These were little chips that had groups of logic gates, and many computer companies used these to make their own computers. But it took several boards. A CPU board would be maybe 2 boards that would be about this big, and hundreds of chips, and that was just the CPU. A whole computer might be 6 boards. It was expensive, hundreds of TTL chips. Woz and Fernandez used about 20 because that's what they had. They built something they called the cream soda computer because they were going down to the store every day and buying big 6-packs of Cragmont cream soda. This was a very small little computer. It was technically a computer. It had 2 4-bit ALU chips, or possibly 4 2-bit ALU chips. If you look at the board, there are actually 4 of these big chips. These are arithmetic logic units. And this is a key part of the CPU. This is the part that actually does the math. So having those in chip form made the computer much smaller than it would have been. You have enough for adding an 8-bit numbers, so it's an 8-bit computer. He bought some static RAM chips, 8 of them. They were 32 bytes each. This was how big memory was then, not kilobytes, bytes. So with 8 you had 256, or 1/4 K of memory. I mean, it's literally 256 numbers can be stored in the memory at all time. It would accept input from switches and output on 8 LEDs. It had to be very simple design. So it had only one register, which was memory, one set of 8 bits that could be stored in the computer. That's a quarter of its memory. Some simple arithmetic instructions. Remember, he's built an adder before. And you can do an instruction between register and the rest of the memory. And there was a couple of branching instructions. So you could actually make it like a Turing complete computer. But, what's the practical result of this? You can input two numbers on switches, display the result, kind of like the adder that he'd built in high school. But it was interesting. It was interesting enough that a local reporter came around from the local paper to write a story on this amazing computer that this kid had built in his garage. Yeah, the reporter came around to write the story and stepped on the power supply, blew up the whole computer. Whoops. These things happen. This was a pretty formative moment for Wozniak, but what did he actually learn from building this computer? Well, one, that you could build your own personal computer. That was a thing you could do because he'd done it. Two, you had to think really hard about how to do it in as few chips as possible. But taking all this time to think about a really elegant, compact design meant that it was small, it was affordable. And so it started something in his head, thinking, wait a minute, maybe. But there was one more thing that the cream soda computer did, and that was, through Bill Fernandez, he was introduced to a new friend, Steve Jobs. So Steve's next project would have nothing to do with computers, but it had everything to do with the company that he was about to found. In October of 1971, Steve Wozniak read an article in Esquire magazine called Secrets of the Little Blue Box. Now, what was this? It was a little device that would emit tones at precisely 2600 hertz into a phone, and additional tones that would then let you control the phone system from the box. Captain Crunch was the pseudonym of a man who had figured out that the whistle in a box of Captain Crunch emitted precisely 2600 hertz. So that was a little fortunate for him. Steve Jobs was impressed with the cream soda computer. But Steve Jobs was really more focused on how could I make money? Wozniak talked to him about the whole blue box idea. Little light bulbs and dollar signs went off in his head, and he said, yeah, we could probably make money on this. They did. They actually sold a couple hundred of these little devices for $150 each, $40 worth of parts, and they split the profit. This was not a computer in the traditional sense. It was more of a music synthesizer. But the success of this venture, even in a small way, they eventually stopped because they got a little scared. They had some run-ins with the police who didn't know what they were doing, but thought they were up to something funny. And they also ran into trouble with a group of people who held them up at gunpoint to get a free blue box and then didn't know how to use it and kept phoning them up to ask how to use it. Anyway, this is not a great business, but for Steve Jobs, he realized that, hey, we can do this. We can have a little company. Maybe something might be possible in the future.
And you might ask, well, what's so interesting about that? What's so interesting is that we were young, and what we learned was that we could build something ourselves that could control billions of dollars worth of infrastructure in the world. That was what we learned, was that us two, we didn't know much, we could build a little thing that could control a giant thing. And that was an incredible lesson. I don't think there would have ever been an Apple computer had there not been blue boxing.
Okay, it's 1973. Woz is 22 years old. He's decided not to finish university at Berkeley. He's finished his third year. Maybe I'll just get a job programming computers or something. He gets a new job at Hewlett-Packard, and his job is to design their calculators. So this is kind of his dream job. He loves Hewlett-Packard, he loves their calculator. He saved up $400 to buy an HP 35 scientific calculator, which was a lot of money at the time. And what's Steve Jobs doing? Well, he also dropped out of college, but he got a job working at Atari.
Have you played Atari today?
Now, Atari was like the hot company at the time. In 1973, they'd done Pong, and they were just really exciting new company to work for. And Steve Jobs got this assignment. Jobs knew a little about electronics, but he couldn't really make things himself. He was a good technician in the sense that he could wire wrap boards and things. He could test things, but he didn't have the ability to make a new thing out of electronics. So when he was given this assignment from his bosses at Atari to redo a circuit board for a game called Breakout, dollar signs went in his eyes again because the bosses offered him $100 for each chip they could remove from the existing design. Remember, chips were very expensive back then. By this time, Jobs is working the night shift. The founder of Atari has literally said that this is because he was too smelly. So he's in the night shift, he has a lot of time on his hands, so he's not being supervised. So he figures, I'll get my friend Steve Wozniak come in and build the board, but of course there's a really tight deadline. There's only 4 days to build this entire board, which is, if you know anything about building your own hobby electronics, this is insane. So Jobs does the testing and the wire wrapping for the board, and Wozniak does all of the design, and they do it in 4 days, or 4 nights straight. And they both got mononucleosis, so sleeping sickness. And in the end, the Woz design saved 50 chips, so that's $5,000 that Steve Jobs got. He told Woz that, I got $700. He didn't tell Woz the full contract, what it was. It was like, I got $700, here's $350. Right, because you did half the work, right? You designed and built, and I wire wrapped the boards. Sure, it's fair. Years later, someone would tell Steve Wozniak, I worked at Atari. Steve got $5,000 for that. And Woz was really sad. Not because of the money. This is the thing about Woz. He didn't care about the money. If Steve had literally told him, I got paid $5,000, but I need the money and I can only afford to give you $350, he would have said, yeah, Steve, I don't care. You're my friend. It was fun. We stayed up 4 nights and we got sleeping sickness. Here, I'll take $350. I don't care. He would have said that, but he was sad that his friend lied to him. And that shows you the difference between a Steve Jobs and a Steve Wozniak. All right, so earlier I mentioned Captain Crunch, the famous phone phreaker, is what they called them, who had built a blue box. His real name was John Draper, and he and Steve Wozniak became friends. In fact, he went and visited Captain Crunch in 1974, and he gave him a demo of connecting to the ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet, on a very expensive terminal. And of course, what does Steve Wozniak do? He immediately goes home and builds his own TV terminal that hooks up to the TV so that he doesn't have to spend all this money he can't afford a real computer terminal. It's a similar design, it's a similar concept to a device that came out only a year earlier in a magazine of radio electronics called the TV typewriter. Steve Wozniak says, no, I was totally unaware of the TV typewriter. I didn't know this existed when I designed my terminal. The design of the terminal, the schematics of it, look very different from the TV typewriter, so I believe Wozniak is telling the truth here. Anyway, what has Woz done so far? He's built a Pong, and he's built a Breakout game, and he's built a terminal. So all these things hook up to the TV. In March 1975, Steve Wozniak was invited by a friend to the very first homebrew computer club. And what was this? This is one of the most important clubs, organizations, basically kickstarted the entire personal computer industry after the Altair had come out just a few months earlier. So it started in a garage of Gordon French in Menlo Park. And Steve was very shy. He didn't like to talk a lot. There were a lot of people, but you had to list the things, the projects that you'd worked on, and Steve listed all of his things, the TV terminal and Breakout and Pong and whatnot. And he also said, he was short on time, which I guess was true. What was actually the Homebrew Computer Club? It was a place mostly for people to talk about computers they might want to build, but also a lot of people had these Altair computers that we talked about, these big boxes with a lot of switches and lights on the front, and they wanted to know, what can you actually do with this? So the early homebrew computer clubs, it was a lot of people bringing their Altairs and saying, what do I do with this? Oh, I made this program that can do this. This is great. And people also shared their own hobby projects. Many of these became computer companies. Woz still wants a computer. This is still his dream to have his own computer. Buying an Altair, the Altair's not that expensive, especially if you assemble it yourself, but it's really not a computer at that point. You have to buy a very expensive terminal. You need the serial port board to connect to it, and a keyboard and all this other stuff. The Homebrew Computing Club teaches him about all these new microprocessors that are coming out on the market. He didn't know about
The first night of the Homebrew Computer Club, when I went home, studied a data sheet and found out what a microprocessor was. Whoa, somehow I had missed out on this. I said, oh my gosh, the whole formula pops in my head.
And he has a revelation. He's like, oh my God, I could build my own computer, a computer I could own and design and do any neat things I wanted to do with it for the rest of my life. That's the sort of way Wozniak thought. This was his dream. His whole life's dream was to just have his own computer. So he starts to make it. He's designed a lot of computers on paper already. He's built a TV terminal. Now, he starts with the terminal as sort of his base, because why not? Just hook up one of these cool microprocessors onto your terminal and you're almost all the way there. You just hook up a keyboard and a power supply and a TV and you've got a whole computer. So how is he going to build this? Well, obviously he needs to use fewer chips, which he already had done for his TV terminal, and he wants to put everything on one board. And what CPU is he going to use? Well, not the Intel 8080. That's too expensive. Unless you're Ed Roberts and can get a discount. No, he wants to use the 6800, the Motorola 6800, that has already been used, as we've seen, to make the SWTP 6800 computer. It's still a little expensive. Steve doesn't have a ton of money. He wants to keep things really inexpensive. And then there's kind of a magical moment. There's a show in San Francisco called WestCon, a computer convention, one of the very first. He goes to a booth and there's Chuck Peddle, founder of MOS Technologies, who we'll return to later in a future episode. And Chuck is literally selling these 6502 chips out of a barrel. It was just a big bin of chips for $20 each. And that's it. Steve buys a bunch of them and a manual, and he gets going. He's going to build his computer. He can do this now. $20 for a CPU. Brilliant. Okay, so he's still working at Hewlett-Packard, and what he'll do is he'll work all day, go home and eat dinner, and then drive back to work and sign in everything. It's all official and legal and above board, and just work on his project.
Everybody was interested in computers, so I started getting a crowd around me, because even though I was too shy to raise my hand and say anything in a club meeting, after the club meetings, I would put my computer that I had built, and every week it had a little bit more working on it too. But I would set it down and let people type on the keyboard. I would explain what's in it. If they come up to me and ask a question, I can answer. Nowadays, I would have the ability to tell them what it is, and be a little bit more promotional. But back then, I could only answer questions if they asked me. But I got a group that started gathering around me. And Steve Jobs saw that I had a lot of interest around me at the club, and he said, let's start selling it. And let's make this company. Came up with the name Apple, and that's how it started.
It doesn't take him very long. A couple of months, he's finished designing the computer, and it's a complete computer. It's not like the cream soda computer. It can have 4 kilobytes of memory. You can hook up a keyboard to it, and it has a little bit of read-only memory, ROM, which is 256 bytes, not very much, for a little program that he writes which is very similar to the monitoring program that the SWTP 6800 computer had, written by Motorola. But of course, Woz didn't know about this computer at all at the time. He didn't know about any of this. He just wrote his own, and it was great. And it was sort of known later on as Wozmon, but it was just a little monitoring program. And he shows his friend, Steve Jobs. He's like, "Hey, look, I built another computer. Isn't this cool?" And he actually goes to the Homebrew Computer Club with his schematics, and he says, "Here, I'll photocopy them. You can have them. Just build your own computer. It's really cool. It's better than this Altair thing." And Steve Jobs is like, people are taking these schematics, but these are the sorts of people who bought an Altair and then didn't know what to do with it. They're not going home and designing a board and putting all the chips together and building this thing. Maybe we could make a board and then sell the motherboard, maybe have a little company. And at first, Steve Wozniak doesn't want to do this. He's like, "I have a job. I don't need another job. I've got a great job at HP." And Steve Jobs is like, "No, here's why we have to do it. Because even if we lose money, even if the whole thing fails and it collapses, we'll still be able to say that we had a company. For once in our lives, we won't be working for anybody. We'll have our own company." Yeah, Steve Wozniak says, "Yeah, no, you're right. Let's do it. That sounds like fun." But technically, Steve Wozniak felt that anything he designs while he's employed for Hewlett-Packard does actually belong to Hewlett-Packard. He's a good, loyal worker. He goes to his boss and says, "This is my design. Technically, it belongs to you. Would you like to have it?" And it doesn't just happen once either. In his memoir, I Was, Steve talks about the number of times he went to Hewlett-Packard and said, "No, really, you can have this for free." In fact, later on, Hewlett-Packard would actually start their own computer division inside the company. And Wozniak was like, "You can just have mine. I just want to be on the team. You can have the whole plan." They're like, No, we don't want it." Okay, so everything's all cleared out of the way for the formation of the first installment of Apple Computer Company. And it was a limited partnership. There were three founders. There was, of course, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, but Jobs found a third sort of shadow partner, Ron Wayne, who was a little bit older, and he did a lot of technical documentation. He came up with the very first Apple logo, which, it's not a good logo. I love that it's Isaac Newton and the Apple, but this is not what logos look like. But yeah, he does the documentation for the Apple I computer, which is what they call it. Yeah, for the partnership, they need to put in a little money to get off the ground, so Ron Wayne puts in $800 of his own money. Woz sells his beloved HP 35 calculator that he paid $400 for, and Jobs sold his old VW bus, because that was what he had to sell. So incidentally, the name Apple was from Steve Jobs. He got it from visiting an apple orchard, and you have to remember, in the 70s, Silicon Valley was a lot of fruit orchards. There was a lot of farming and a lot of agriculture. And in fact, Steve Wozniak's house was right next to an apricot orchard. People had apple trees in their backyard. Yeah, the actual circuit board, Steve Jobs says, "Oh, I know this guy at Atari. He'll do the whole layout for the board," which was very simple, but still, it's a pretty big motherboard. And for $800, just one time, and then we'll have the design and we can actually manufacture it in-house. So now Steve Jobs, he's excited. They've got a new computer. So he goes down to what might actually have been the very first personal computer store in the world, and that was Paul Terrell's Byte Shop. And so he goes down with an Apple I. It's just the motherboard, but he has it all hooked up to a keyboard and a TV, and does a little demo. Isn't this cool? And he gets an order. So he phones up Steve Wozniak, who's there working at HP, and he calls him up and says, "Are you sitting down? Are you sitting down? Well, guess what? I just got a $50,000 order." The $50,000 was actually twice Woz's annual salary. So they're on their way. Now they have to actually build these things. Now they have some money, in theory, coming in, but they have to first deliver the product, and then they get paid. So the company starts mostly in Steve Jobs' bedroom at his parents' place. The garage is kind of a myth. Hewlett-Packard was started in a garage. So the myth is Apple was started in a garage. Well, they did use the garage, but not that much, just for testing. There's a little sort of overflow for testing some of the boards. And there was Jobs' father built a heat lamp box thing that you could put boards in to test them to make sure they don't fail. That's fine. They need to get the parts and assemble them. Steve Jobs discovers this wonderful thing called Net 30. And then you can order up the parts from the chip companies and get a Net 30 account. You pay for it 30 days later. They hire Bill Fernandez and Jobs' friend Daniel Kotke to help assemble these things and help test them and build the boards. The boards have all the chips in sockets, which is really good, because then if a chip fails, you just pry it out and pop another one in. But it does mean that you can't just solder everything together and you're done with the board. You solder all the sockets in, and then you have to put in all the chips in sockets, which is kind of monotonous. But Jobs gets his own sister, pays her a little bit while she's watching TV to just kind of plug those chips in. Before the 30 days is up and they have to pay, goes down to the bite shop and says, "Here you go. Here are your 50 computers." Now, Paul Terrell really thought that he was getting complete computers. This was just the motherboard. But he still paid. You have to think about what it was like at the time. Most computer companies, even the SWTP 6800, these early days, you usually got them as a kit. You certainly saved a lot of money, and the company making them it took way too long to actually get an assembled version. So usually you're building it from a kit anyway. So, okay, I thought I was getting a fully assembled computer, but I'm getting a motherboard. But that's kind of what I'm doing anyway in business. So Paul Terrell pays, and suddenly Apple is a real business. They have money. They can pay all their suppliers. They can sell more computers. Woz is 25 years old, and Jobs is 21 this time. The units are completed, and Woz decides he was going to show this off at Homebrew in March 1976. They have some money coming in, so they start taking out ads. Actual ads. Then the price, $666.66. Woz will tell you, oh, it had nothing to do with the devil thing, the number. 500 was sort of the wholesale price, and then the retail price, if you bought it directly from Apple, would be around 666. Nice round number. Woz likes repeating digits, but I think Steve Jobs probably understood and thought it was funny to have that price. Anyway, the company, they were selling computers, and not just the first 50, they started selling them to other people, other stores, and by early 1976, they've sold about 150 of these things. That's not much, but it is a sustainable business. Okay, so you've gone down to the store, the bite shop, or wherever, and you bought a brand new Apple I computer, bring it home. Well, what do you do with it? Well, this was actually less of a computer than the SWTP 6800 that we talked about, and which had come out a little bit earlier in November of 1975. You have this nice motherboard, pretty inexpensive, and you can connect it to your TV directly. It was NTSC only, so only North America, and you needed a little thing called an RF modulator, because TVs at the time didn't have video in. That wasn't a thing. There were no VCRs. What would you be putting video in of anyway? Now you still had to hook up your own keyboard. It wasn't super complicated, but you had to get the right kind of keyboard, and maybe you had to do a little fiddling with the wiring. So that's not great either. You also had to provide your own power supply, which is, the schematics are there and you can bring your own. Okay, fine. That's not the end of the world. But then you also need a case, which is the hilarious thing about this computer is that everyone bought it and nobody had a case. Some of the stores, like the Byte Shop, would build their own cases out of wood. Other times, you just make your own case out of wood and carve the word Apple into it. Why not? It's fun. Actually, it kind of does sound like fun. Anyway, you had this and you hooked it up to your TV and you got your keyboard. It had to be an ASCII keyboard, a specific type of standardized keyboard. We still use the ASCII convention today. All right, well now what does it do? It'll display 40 characters per line, 24 lines. It's got scrolling. These are uppercase only. It's only black and white. And there's no backspace. You can't, because of the way the terminal was designed. With the terminal, a lot of them emulated the old printing terminals in which backspace on a printing terminal made no sense. You'd just be writing over stuff that was already on the paper. So you hit backspace, it prints a little underscore, and that tells you that as far as the computer is concerned, it deleted that last letter, but you still have to remember, okay, that's not great, that's not great. So it's a bit of a cross between a terminal and a computer. Obviously, that's the way Steve designed it. When you boot it up, the monitor program is built in, it's on the board. It boots right into the monitor. That's Wozmon, written by Woz, 256 bytes, which even Woz admitted, that was a little tough, squeezing it in there. And people looked at the code today, and boy, the tricks you had to do to fit. Because it had to print things, it had to look at memory, modify memory, start executing at any one place. Okay. And, what else could you do with it? Well, Woz went and got this book. Yes, this exact book, not this copy, obviously. 101 Basic Computer Games. And he said, great, I need BASIC on my computer. Did he have one? No. So he just wrote one, like you do. He was a little bit lazy. He didn't want to do floating point numbers. I understand floating point numbers are a pain. So he just called it integer BASIC. But it was available very cheaply, and you could load that on a cassette tape. This is another, you had to buy a little cassette interface, okay, another thing to buy. But it's fine. Your regular tape cassette, start loading programs in it. You can save programs, write your own, run BASIC, and this is kind of funny actually, because in his memoir, Steve Wozniak talks about how surprised he was going through that book and finding that these programs are all in different types of BASIC. They actually predate personal computers. They're from all different kinds of mini computers, and every BASIC is different, has different things, and you have to translate them all. I think it's funny because I had exactly the same experience with that book when I went to write my own, type those programs into BASIC. I had to change them all and convert them. And it was kind of fun that Woz and I share that experience. Yeah, so here's this nice little computer that once you buy the $75 cassette interface, you can run BASIC games now, like that have been ported over from this book, like Hammurabi, Lunar Lander, and of course Star Trek. I mean, of course you have Star Trek. So the Apple I was marginally successful for the time. Wasn't really setting the world on fire compared to its competitors. Overall, it was only on the market for a year. It sold between 200 and 300 units. That's okay, not great. But of course, Woz was not satisfied with this at all. He was already working on a design for the Apple II. Because, great, he had his own computer, but now he wanted more. He wanted color. He wanted to be able to play Breakout in color. So he needed paddles. Apple I was being sold all through the middle of 1976. In August, he finished his first Apple II board. This was really something. When he showed it to Steve Jobs, Steve was like, no, this is the thing. And of course it was. It was way better. Like, not just a little bit better than the Apple I, but so much better. Steve Jobs was like, if we just had a little more money, we could make this really nice. All these problems we had with the Byte Shop wanting fully finished computers with a keyboard and a case and everything, and you just plug it in and go. And of course, competitors are doing this too now. There are some other computers out there that are all-in-one that we'll get to, like the Sol from Processor Technology. So Jobs goes to get some venture capital. He first goes to the banks. They don't want to give him any money. He starts asking around. He gets in touch with Arthur Rock, who manages a venture capital fund. Arthur Rock thinks, this guy's a little weird, but he's pretty smart, and maybe he's got something. Put him in touch with an ex-Intel manager, Mike Markula, who had retired early, had multiple millions of dollars from Intel stock. So Markula invested his own money and got some venture capital after he had invested this, and they were off. And the Apple II was released April 16th, 1977, which is only a year after the Apple I came out. Of course, the Apple II is a completely separate video, probably many videos, because it's a lot. It's cool. It's a cool computer, but it's a lot. Apple I's today are super expensive, and they only seem to be getting more so over time. Now, why is this? Well, Apple only ever sold a couple hundred, but when the Apple II came out a year later, they offered a trade-in program where you could send in your Apple I motherboard and get a discount on a brand new Apple II, which was like 1,000 times better. So most people did that. Apple didn't do a lot with the old boards. They just kind of left them in a room somewhere. Most of them were lost. There are only 63 left known to exist, and maybe a couple more that people aren't talking about because they want to get that big cash prize. But the Apple I was important because it led directly to the Apple II, which was a huge success, becoming the third best-selling computer of 1977, and only went up from there. It became this huge thing that turned Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak into multimillionaires and changed the course of computer history forever. But that's the story for another day. If you liked this video and you would like me to make more, please hit the subscribe button, and the little bell notification button will let you know when I make another one. And thank you for watching. See you next time. All right, we did it. We did it, boys. We have to remember to stop. We have to remember to stop.